The flight didn't land in London. It touched down on a runway that was still under construction in 1945. Captain Miller looked out the cockpit window at the Spitfires lined up on the tarmac. His digital instruments were screaming, but the radio was filled with the crackle of big band music. He checked the GPS, but the screen was a blank void of green light. The air in the cabin smelled of ozone and vintage tobacco. "Ladies and gentlemen," he whispered into the intercom, "I think we've taken a wrong turn into the architecture of the past." A man in a trench coat was standing at the end of the runway, holding a signaling lamp that flashed in a rhythmic biological pulse. It wasn't Morse code, it was a heartbeat. The ground beneath the plane began to ripple like a curtain caught in a heavy wind. Miller opened the cabin door and was met by a wall of cold, gray mist. The passengers behind him were no longer people. They were silhouettes made of static and unspooled film. They weren't scared. They were waiting for their cues to step back into history. The man in the trench coat approached the stairs. His face was a blurred smudge, like a thumbprint on a photograph. "You're off course, Captain," he hissed. "This sector of time is currently being rewoven. You're a loose thread in a very delicate design." Miller realized the runway wasn't concrete. It was a giant loom made of iron and light. The Spitfires were the needles, and the sky was the fabric. The weaver of the war was trying to fix a leak in the timeline, and Flight 702 was the unexpected snag. "I have 200 souls on board," Miller shouted against the rising wind. The weaver tilted his head, his voice sounding like 1,000 newspapers rustling. "Souls are just ink, Captain. We can always rewrite the ending. We just need to bleach the pages first." A silver needle, 40 feet long, descended from the clouds. It began to stitch the wings of the plane directly into the tarmac. Miller felt his memories of the future, smartphones, his daughter's face, the modern world, begin to fade into a dull, sepia wash. He grabbed the emergency axe and swung at the glowing threads. The impact sent a jolt of pure energy through his arms. He wasn't hitting rope, he was hitting the literal logic of the universe. The weaver wailed, a sound like a record player slowing to a stop. "The flight must land," Miller roared. He jumped back into the cockpit and jammed the throttles forward. The engines roared with a sound that tore through the fabric of the 1940s. The silver threads snapped, lashing out like whips of white-hot lightning. The plane lurched upward, the runway dissolving into a swirl of ink and ash. For a moment, Miller saw the entire world as a giant, unfinished tapestry, with millions of hands working the needles. Then, with a thunderous crack, the digital screens flickered back to life. "Heathrow Tower, this is Flight 702. We are back on approach." The air was warm again. The smell of tobacco was gone. The passengers were breathing, complaining about the turbulence. Miller looked at his hands. They were shaking, and his sleeves were stained with soot. He landed the plane perfectly, but when he stepped onto the tarmac, he saw a single, vintage signaling lamp sitting on the modern concrete. It was cold, rusted, and engraved with his own name. The past hadn't let go. It had just marked him for later. He never flew again. He spent his retirement staring at the sky, watching the vapor trails of other planes. He knew that the clouds weren't just water vapor. They were the seams of a world that was constantly being unraveled and repaired by unseen hands.